Has unveiled several high-profile foreign policy plans during his presidency, and some have come in the last few days. On Wednesday, he reimposed limits on the amount of money Cuban Americans can send to relatives on the island, and he vetoed legislation on Tuesday that would have forced him to end the U.S. military role in Yemen. Daniel Drezner, a professor at Tufts University, argues there is a certain level of angst over President Trump's foreign policy agenda, but he says the worrying is nothing new. In an op-ed for Foreign Affairs magazine, Drezner argues that America's foreign policy strength was faltering long before President Trump took office. He says many of the guardrails that have kept it on track have been worn down. And Daniel joins us now via Skype from Chicago. As I said, he is a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He is also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is a very important man, and we are happy to see him. Daniel, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me, DeMarco.
All right, so the first question, what do you believe is the biggest thing that has changed with American foreign policy in the last quarter century?
I would say the biggest thing that's changed is essentially a profound suspicion of what we would consider people like me, people who are ostensibly experts in foreign policy, what some would call the foreign policy community. There's been a series of, significant foreign policy mistakes, the most obvious being the war in Iraq, but also the inattention to the financial bubble that led to the 2008 financial crisis, the intervention in Libya, and to some extent the intervention and non-intervention in Syria. So there's a fair amount of screw-ups, and as a result, the wisdom of people like me is often being challenged.
All right, Daniel, so how much do you think the current political polarization affects American foreign policy?
Unfortunately, it affects it a huge deal. One of the things that the foreign policy community did have in common was that there was a relatively decent bipartisan consensus. This isn't to say that Republican and Democratic foreign policy makers agreed with each other on everything, but they respected the other side. There was a sort of, genuine debate and exchange of ideas. We're now in a situation where essentially the partisans on both the left and right have turned foreign policy into a partisan plaything. And so as a result, policies that, let's say, a Democratic president might implement when the Republican president takes over automatically gets countermanded in a way that was not necessarily true even a decade ago.
Are you right that many of the sources of American power are ebbing? What exactly do you mean by this, ebbing?
Well, it's worth realizing, for example, that, as long as most of us have been alive, the United States has been the largest economy in the world, except technically by one standard, we're actually no longer the largest economy in the world. China eclipsed us if you measure GDP by something called purchasing power parity a couple of years ago. Furthermore, a lot of the sort of traditional pillars that we assume are part of America's strength, the fact that we have the best institutions of higher education, the fact that we're a magnet for migration and for talented entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, this is where the Trump administration in particular has really exacerbated things. We're seeing foreign student applications and entrances into the United States decline for 2 years in a row. And as a result, the sort of sources of dynamism that we have traditionally relied on appear to be eroding.
You also say that our foreign policy has traditionally worked because of the natural equilibrium of checks and balances. Why do you believe that is no longer the case?
Essentially, what's been happening is that over the last 30 to 40 years, the polarization that you talked about before infected Congress first. So it became very difficult for Congress to agree to anything on foreign policy. And what they wound up doing was essentially ceding more and more of their power to the president because the president was viewed as the last adult in the room. The problem is that the presidents have also gotten more ideologically extreme. You can argue that Barack Obama was the most liberal president we've ever had, and Donald Trump is certainly the most conservative president we've ever had. And now imagine what U.S. foreign policy will look like if Trump is replaced by someone like, let's say, Bernie Sanders, and then Bernie Sanders is replaced by someone like Tom Cotton, and then Tom Cotton is replaced by someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. With so much foreign policy power being ceded to the president, each successive president can essentially wipe the slate clean and erase whatever commitments the prior president made. And the fundamental strength of American foreign policy for decades has been our ability to credibly commit to things. And that's what's being eroded now.
All right. You also do believe that President Trump's, or do you, I should say, do you believe that President Trump's current foreign policy will have lingering effects on how foreign countries and other countries view the United States in the future?
Absolutely. If you assume a scenario where, let's say, a Democrat wins in 2020 and tries to pursue a restorationist foreign policy, it's going to be tempting to say, see, Trump was an aberration. This won't happen again. Except foreign countries have long memories. And the question isn't whether Donald Trump is going to win. It's whether the successor to the Democratic successor winds up actually being more nationalist than Donald Trump. You've seen no end in sight in terms of the degree of political polarization in our country. And that's the fundamental thing that will have to change to be convinced that whoever the Republican successor to Trump isn't as problematic as Trump to the rest of the world.
All right, I can listen to you talk all day long. Daniel Drezner, thanks a lot for joining us, man. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Thank you very much, DeMarco.